Welcome everyone for joining our webinar today on measuring and managing your company's waste-generated emissions. I'm Liu-Sontag. I'm a senior manager here on our sustainability team. Today I'm joined by Jasmine Zhuang. Jasmine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine. I'm our head of product here at Sustain.Life, and that means I work with several of the teams at our company, but namely the sustainability, design, and engineering teams to build out all the features and functionality you'll see in our platform. So today I'll be doing a quick demo of our waste calculator, but first I'll hand it off to Nick to give an overview of the topic as a whole.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. For those of you that are unfamiliar with SustainLife, we are a subscription software platform where we help you measure, manage, and report your environmental impacts. Today, we're going to be going through what we do when it comes to waste emissions. And as Jasmine mentioned, you'll get a little peek at our product at the end. In terms of what we'll cover, we're going to talk about the greenhouse gas protocol. So we're all on the same page on what kinds of emissions we're talking about today. We're also going to get into a little bit of the science of waste to understand what are the sources of waste emissions, where do those emissions actually come from? And we're also going to talk about this idea of biogenic emissions, which are important when we're considering waste. Lastly, we'll briefly touch on some of the high-level waste reduction strategies. And then, as Jasmine mentioned, we'll do a demo at the end. Before we jump into things, I want to preface this conversation and talk about waste as an environmental issue overall. The emissions from waste is only one aspect of the issue of waste. We care about waste for other reasons beyond just the emissions. We care about waste because it often ends up in places that we don't want it to be, such as our waterways and oceans, where it causes ecological harm or eventually human harm when it makes its way through the food chain. We also care about waste because when we produce waste, it means we're inefficiently using non-renewable resources. These two aspects of waste are not necessarily always reflected when we're looking at emissions. So today we're just talking about waste emissions, but your organization may have a small amount of waste emissions. That doesn't mean that waste is not a material issue for you. Looking here at the greenhouse gas protocol, we have the 3 different scopes of emissions, as well as all the different categories of scope 3 emissions. Just to ground ourselves, so we're all on the same page on what we're discussing today. Today, we're talking about emissions from operational waste, also known as waste generated in operations. This is a scope 3 category because these emissions, though they happen from waste that your organization is producing, the emissions are from third parties. So for example, your waste hauler or the waste treatment site where your waste is ultimately ending up. If, for example, you are treating your own waste, then that means you're directly emitting those gases, and those emissions would fall actually under scope 1 in that case. So we're talking about here, you're handing your waste off to a third party, and they're creating emissions from that waste. You also might notice that the operational waste category here is on the upstream side of your value chain. And this might be confusing because you're handing your waste off and it's being treated after your organization has produced it. It's on the upstream side here because the waste hauler and the waste treatment site are providing services to your organization. And in a sense, they're suppliers. And the upstream side of the value chain is the one that's associated with your suppliers. I also want to talk about how this is operational waste. Obviously, there's waste produced up and down your entire value chain, but what we're talking about today is the waste that your organization directly produces. So one specific example is if you manufacture a physical good, and your customers at the end of the life of that physical good are going to dispose of it. The emissions from that disposal falls under a different category called the end-of-life treatment of sold products. So right now, we're just talking about the waste that you produce and that gets treated by third parties. In terms of where does the emissions actually come from when we're disposing waste, there are a few different processes that produce emissions. First, the one that exists for all of them is the transportation of that waste. So your waste haulers vehicles are included in this category. But then each of the different treatment methods will release different kinds of gases, and those gases will be produced through a different set of processes. The first thing that I think is important to know is that most of the waste that we produce has carbon in it. If it's organic material like food waste or agricultural waste, then that carbon was originally absorbed by some plant from the atmosphere. Even if it's plastic, though plastic takes a long time to break down, plastic is predominantly made from carbon, and that carbon is sourced from fossil fuels. When we break down these materials, that carbon, or a lot of that carbon, is then released back into the atmosphere. So here are some of the primary treatment methods for solid waste. And below them, I have the predominant process that produces emissions. And then we also see the predominant gas that is produced as a result of that process. All of these will release multiple types of greenhouse gases, but these are the primary ones that we are concerned about. So starting on the left, though it is less common, I think it's an illustrative example. We start with composting. In composting, we're breaking down organic matter like agricultural waste and food waste through a process called aerobic digestion. We're not going to dive too deep into the specifics. The two things you need to know about aerobic digestion are a bunch of microbes are breaking down this material in the presence of air, and as a result, they produce carbon dioxide. So if you've ever done any composting, either at home or at your business, you know that it's important to turn your compost pile regularly. And the reason we do that is to provide air, make sure air is getting to all parts of the pile so that we can get this aerobic digestion thing moving. Contrast that with landfilling. Though the surface of a landfill is exposed to the air, the majority of the material in a landfill is compressed deep below the surface. When it's below the surface like that, it can't access enough air to go through aerobic digestion. And so the process in a landfill is called anaerobic digestion. With anaerobic digestion, the output is not CO2, it's CH4, which we know as methane. This is one of the primary reasons that landfills in particular have a really high climate impact, because methane has a 30 times greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide. So we can take the same type of material and the same amount of material and compost it. And then if we take that same material and landfill it, we'll actually have a 30 times greater impact on the climate. Then moving on, we've got recycling, where we're not actually breaking down the material, but returning it back to some raw material that we can use again. The primary source of emissions here is the energy that goes into melting down the plastic or melting down the metal, and that releases CO2. And then finally, if your waste is being burned, if it's being incinerated, then that process directly is releasing CO2. If you've done any amount of greenhouse gas accounting or greenhouse gas reporting, then you might have come across this term, biogenic emissions. And biogenic emissions exist for categories beyond just waste, but in particular, there's something important to pay attention to when we're doing waste accounting. Biogenic emissions basically just mean that the emissions, the gases that are being emitted, ultimately came from a plant. So if we look at this top process here, what we have is CO2 on the left that's in the atmosphere. It gets absorbed by some kind of plant, and then somehow that plant ends up in a compost pile. Let's say, that was a crop or something like that. As we know from the previous slide, composting releases CO2. And you can see that the CO2 that's released in this process was actually recently just in the atmosphere as CO2. So this is a bit of a cyclical process. And what's happened is we actually haven't added any new CO2 to the atmosphere. For this reason, biogenic CO2 is considered carbon neutral and theoretically has no net warming effect. If we contrast this with landfilling that plant in the second process below, it's very similar at the start. We've got CO2 in the atmosphere, the plant absorbs it, but then that plant ends up in a landfill. Well, as we know, landfills create methane, not CO2. And so there is a net warming effect, because what was previously CO2 in the atmosphere it is now CH4, which is 30 times worse. And so this is an important concept, because in greenhouse gas accounting and reporting, we generally separate out biogenic CO2 from all of our other emissions. So although the methane here is biogenic methane, that still goes into our regular inventory, but because the biogenic CO2 is carbon neutral, we keep it separate. This idea of biogenic emissions also comes up with biofuels in particular. So if you have bioethanol, then you have corn that absorbs atmosphere from the atmosphere, that absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then ultimately is fermented into ethanol. When you burn that ethanol, you get biogenic emissions, including biogenic CO2. And although it's a topic for another day, I think in practice, biofuels are probably not as carbon neutral as we like to think, but something to keep an eye out for. And then finally, some of the larger waste reduction strategies. This is obviously a whole topic unto itself, and these strategies are also going to vary sector by sector. But overall, the three things you want to be thinking about is the best thing you can do is source reduction. Let's not create that waste to begin with. So, if you are an apparel maker, can we find ways to more efficiently cut fabrics so that we're ending up with fewer scraps at the end that we have to dispose of? Are we making it easier for people to recycle materials, to separate their materials out so that we can increase diversion, which would be the second one, is diverting materials away from landfills and incineration facilities, which would also involve, working closely with your waste haulers to make sure that your waste is actually going to where you want it to go and being separated in the ways you want it to be separated. And then finally, material selection, which kind of goes hand in hand with increasing diversion. Can we select for certain materials that are easier to divert? Can we select for materials that are compostable so that at the end of their life, they can be sent to a composting facility as opposed to a landfill or even recycling? So I hope this gives you a good overview of both what are waste emissions, where do they come from, and then a little bit about what you should be thinking about when you're looking at your waste footprint. And with that, I will hand it off to Jasmine for our demo.
Great, thanks, Nick. And just a quick note on housekeeping. If you have any questions that come up through this presentation or the demo, feel free to pop them in the Q&A in your Zoom app, and we will get to them at the end. Anything we don't get to, we'll try to answer through email. So if there's a question you definitely want answered, please make sure not to submit it anonymously so we can get it back to you. And with that, I'll dive into the demo. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Nick, I can pull up mine. Great, thank you. Okay, hi everyone. So today I'll be going through a demo of our waste calculator. But before I do that, let me just remind you of what SustainLife does as a platform as a whole. And so you'll see here, as we mentioned in the beginning, we really have our application structured into 3 pillars: measure, manage, and report. And we help companies of all sizes measure, manage, and report their environmental impact, namely their carbon emissions, but also other environmental indicators, such as their water consumption, their energy consumption, and their waste production, which I'll go into in more detail here. So this is our overall measure dashboard. At a high level, we take your business activities across a variety of categories and translate those into emissions so that you can calculate your overall organizational carbon footprint. What we also do is allocate those emissions to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as well as the corresponding greenhouse gas protocol category, which you'll see listed here under each of the cards. And so in this specific case, we'll be talking about waste generated in operations here, which falls under scope 3. And you can also see a high level impact by each of your categories, but I'll pull up the waste example to show you. At a high level, you can see on your dashboard here, your total emissions that are coming from your waste, your total spend, as well as the total amount of waste produced in terms of weight per category. And so each of these colors represents a different subcategory of type of waste. So from here, I'll go directly into the waste calculator, which you can navigate to here. The very first thing you'll do is set up each of your locations. And this makes sure that each of your location preferences represents and reflects the setup that you have. So for example, let's pull up your Los Angeles location. You might only be getting one number from your waste hauler, and it's not broken down into any more level of detail. And so in this case, you might just want to select a simple preference, and we'll default that number to landfill trash for all of your waste. And that's just because we don't have a more granular breakdown that we can represent here. For New York, on the other hand, you might get a much more detailed and granular breakdown of your waste from your bills or from your waste hauler. So in this case, you'll be able to break down not only trash versus recyclables, but also how your trash is disposed of. Is it landfilled, incinerated, or waste to energy? And then for recyclables, you can select mixed recyclables if you don't have a more granular breakdown. But if you do have the exact material type, you can select those as well. And then, as Nick mentioned, you might also want to be tracking compost and organics, universal waste, and then donations and reuse. And then in the case where you see a waste type that isn't reflected in our standard categories, you can always track custom sources under the proper category. And so if you have a custom mix and you want to add your own custom emissions factors, you can do that, and it will be allocated back to your total waste emissions and your total scope 3. So once you finish configuring all of your preferences, you can then navigate over to our entry section, where you'll be able to enter data for the locations you've just configured. So for example, for New York, this was the location that you can track your waste in more granular terms. So all you do here is enter your total waste that you're grabbing from your waste bills or your waste hauler. You can select the proper unit of measure, which might differ across your locations. And then you can optionally track any of the spend that corresponds to each of these waste types. And this will just help you keep track of your costs and your budget that you're spending on waste over time. And then what you'll see here that we're doing automatically in the background is pulling the proper emissions factor from our data sets that represent the location that you're tracking for, as well as the date range. And so, for example, for New York, we're pulling data from the EPA factors from the US government, and that's how we're calculating the emissions here. So what you can see is for the same amount of waste across landfilled trash versus recyclables, the amount of emissions from your recyclables is much lower than it is for landfilled trash. And so the more that you can divert from the landfill, the lower your emissions can be. And so each of these has a different emissions factor that we're applying to make sure that we're giving you the most accurate representation of your footprint based on your waste types. Same thing for compost and organics. And then lastly, for donations and reuse, we assume an emissions factor of 0. You can also attach any kind of bills, documentation, or notes here, and that's just helpful for later on if you're getting audited or you're getting your emissions data verified, or you're just looking to collaborate internally with other teammates and you want to make sure that you're tracking each of your references and notes so that you can always look back and reference them. And the last thing I'll call out on this screen is that we make it easy to align with external frameworks and disclosures. And so, for example, if you're looking to track your carbon emissions footprint and calculate it for the purposes of being able to disclose externally, for example, submitting those emissions numbers to CDP, you can easily click the framework or disclosure that applies to you, and we will highlight the inputs and outputs that will be relevant. And so here you'll see almost everything is relevant here as it contributes to your total emissions footprint. And once you're done tracking a year's worth of baseline data, you'll be able to go to our sustainability reporting feature and pull the data that is required to submit to CDP. So once you're done, you can go ahead and save, and you'll be brought back to the main waste category page, where you'll be able to see a ledger of all of the entries you've tracked over time, as well as a high-level summary of your total emissions and spend broken down by category. If you'd like, the more streamlined way to enter this data is actually through our bulk upload feature. So you can track data for multiple months or even multiple years at a time in a simple Excel template where you can download the template from here and upload in one go. And this will be a huge time saver for you to be able to easily calculate your footprint from a single upload. So once you've gathered enough data, you can get a high level view here, but the more helpful place to look for reporting is under our reporting module. So under SustainLife's reporting module, you'll see several different types of reports. So at a high level, you'll be able to see how your waste emissions fit in context with the rest of your footprint. But if you want to go into more detail on waste specifically, you can pull up your waste report. Here, you'll be able to track trends over time. You can narrow in on specific date ranges or specific locations. And then you'll also be able to track high-level metrics, such as your total diversion rate. So how much are you diverting from the landfill? And how is that changing over time? You can view your spend over time, as well as your total emissions and spend by type. And this way, you can identify those trends and those hotspots in more granular insights to inform your next steps. And then lastly, what you can do is go over to our managed platform. And so an important thing about our platform is we not only empower you to be able to measure all of your emissions and waste data, but also take action off of it and actually make operational changes to how your business operates and your processes. So under the managed platform, I'll highlight the guides feature here. These are really productionalized sustainability strategies. We have over 100 of them broken out by category that help you implement these for your company. And so if you navigate over to our guides, you'll see that we have several guides across different areas. And these are ways of making sure that you can actually implement these actions and reduce your impact. For waste specifically, we have several actions here. And so they range anything from smaller actions like reducing printing or eliminating single-use disposables in your office, and then broader actions like how to implement and start a recycling program or composting program. And each of these will help walk you step by step through the actions. You can add them to your roadmap so that you can track your status and completion at any moment of time. And then we'll also help you with any kind of policies that you need to implement. So we've handwritten language around implementing waste management policies so that you can easily add them to your company's handbook without much effort on your part. And then lastly, we'll show you how each of these actions align to leading third-party frameworks and standards, whether it's True Zero Waste or CDP or the B impact assessment. And so in summary, what we're able to help you do with your waste emissions is first start by measuring them and getting a handle on what your baseline emissions are. Then managing them and implementing operational changes, and then reporting to pull data either for internal reporting to your teammates and to your company leadership or external disclosures and sustainability reports. And with that, I will move over to the Q&A. It looks like we've had a few come in, so we'll move over to that section.
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, we got quite a few questions here. One that I wanted to answer live was this question that is, for trash, are carbon impacts not varied depending on the material? And is it okay to group material type by waste stream? This is a good question. And if you saw on the input screen, when we collect your waste data, for things like recycling, we break them down into the different materials, but for things like landfilling or trash, we're not breaking out the individual materials, though the individual materials that are in that waste stream do impact the emissions. What we're actually doing is using data that we have on typical waste streams, and then based on your other waste streams, for example, let's say you say that you're recycling plastic and paper. What we do is we're actually updating and creating a mini model of what your trash landfill waste stream looks like, what materials are in it. Okay, you're recycling your paper and your plastic, therefore there's less of that in your waste stream, and we update the carbon calculations to account for that. So good question. Let's see, looking through the other questions here. What other emission factor sources are you using in addition to the EPA warm model? The EPA warm model is, for those who don't know, it's a modeling tool that the EPA has created for organizations to model their the impact of their waste, but also do cost benefit in terms of maybe switching materials or diverting different materials. So we use both emission factors from the EPA as well as the warm model itself to get more granular emission factors that are not provided by the EPA. And then the other primary source we use is DEFRA, which is the basically EPA of the UK, which publishes emission factors. Those two are generally reflective of typical emissions for waste treatment around the world, but we are actively working on increasing the granularity of our factors. We got another question. Is there a limit on locations that the tool supports? Jasmine?
There's no limit, but that will all be dependent, or that will feed into the pricing based on the number of locations, the amount of data you're entering, but there's no limit, practical limit on the number of locations you can track. And then I'll answer another question around tagging data per client. So example, we collect waste produced during the production of a client's project. Can we report to our clients what their emissions may be for the project? So you might have seen, as I was going through the demo, something called groups. And so you can, there are a few ways of doing it. If you like a more portfolio level view where you're actually measuring each of your clients' data in a different account, we can set up an account that way. So you're essentially the parent and able to manage the information across your child accounts. The other way to do it is by creating groups or tags in our system. And so those could be associated with locations. So you might have a set of locations that is tied to a specific client, and you can have all of those tagged to that client, or you can create separate entry level tags that will allow you to track each of the entries that you saw I saved under different tags. And then when it comes to going to your waste report, you'll be able to filter by those tags. So definitely support that level of detail.
Another question we got here is, if we have a nationwide portfolio of buildings, are there any reliable vendors or tools to create accurate waste hauling data for landfill and recycling? It sounds like this person is asking about, it's difficult to get accurate data as to the amount of waste that you're producing for various streams. And this is a very real challenge. Many waste haulers will not provide regular amounts to you, or if they do, they're providing it in a volume, and then you have to convert to weight, or our system can convert to weight for you, but then you're relying on some assumptions. Right now, the current best practice is to do regular audits of your waste, where you are, taking a typical week of operations and spending the time to weigh it out and see what are in the different streams, and then using that data as a representative for the rest of the year if you're unable to get good data from your waste hauler. Let's see here. We got a question on, there's some questions that are a little bit outside the realm of waste. We have one on how do we calculate emissions for employees working from home. We have as part of our tool that Jasmine demoed, there's another category for it falls under people, where we have a tool where you can calculate those emissions, and you can even estimate their wattage for their home electronic equipment for working if you're unable to get that information. Okay, I think that mostly covers it. What we're going to do is, just to be respectful of people's time, we'll end the webinar here, but we do have some other questions, and what we'll do is we will email you responses. So if you provided your name and email, then we will get back to you later this week. So thanks for your time today, and we hope to see you in the next webinar.
Thank you everyone for joining.